And then she also began writing essays for publication. She'd been writing all along, but she was encouraged by one of her Harvard buddies to write for a paper that he was doing out in the West. And she also was encouraged by her father to write an essay on a book that was about slavery. And that was her first published essay, was that essay. And then, while she was in Groton, her father suddenly died of cholera. And this is when her financial problems really started. They found out that he really didn't have that much money. And even though Massachusetts was fairly progressive and would have allowed the widow to take over and manage the money, one of the uncles stepped in and took over. And it's not clear to me whether he took some of that money. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's not clear. It seems logical to me that he siphoned some of it off, or there just wasn't much. But the rest of her life, he was doling out the money in very small amounts, and she was always begging, borrowing money, and trying to figure out ways to earn it. One of the ways she earned it was by becoming a teacher. She got a really good job teaching, a well-paid job, teaching in Rhode Island for a year and a half or so. And the other major source of income that she developed was her conversations. I'll get to that in a minute. But while she was still in Groton, she was invited out to Concord to visit Ralph Waldo Emerson, and became involved in the Transcendentalist circle. And that's really where she connected with Transcendentalism. It was a mostly male circle, and she became the most significant woman member. And then when it came time for them to publish a journal, they asked her, none of them wanted to touch it. It was too radical an idea for them to touch. So they asked her to be the editor and promised to pay her, and which they never did. And so eventually she had to quit being the editor. But in those first, I think she edited 3 issues, she helped define Transcendentalism, which really became the first American literary movement. Would you agree with that?
Well,
in a way?
Well, I don't know. Probably go back a little bit, but
go back a little bit.
Certainly one of the first.
One of the first. Okay.
Truly American.
Truly American, purely American.
Right.
Yeah. So, all right, moving right along here. So she also wrote articles for the journal. And at first she wrote commentaries on other authors and ideas, and then on the art and music that she was seeing in Boston. But before long, she turned to writing about what she experienced most directly in her life, the inferior status of women. And from our perspective in the early 21st century, I think it's very difficult for us to understand the enormity of what it meant for her to question the gender norms of her day. And think about this is a mere half century after the formation of the country. Biographer Belle Chavigny asserts, to conceive of women differently was tantamount to challenging the assumptions on which the nation was built. And to do this, Belle says, she had to create a way of life that was not yet possible, and a self whose nature was without local example. I find that a very interesting idea. And maybe some of you have been in that position of having to create a way of life that is not yet possible, and a self whose nature is without local example. That's what it really means to be a trailblazer. Now, fortunately, she wasn't the only woman who was thinking along these lines, and the conversations that after she came back from Providence, where she taught, she moved to Boston. She was back and forth to Groton for a while, but she actually kind of moved to Boston. And to support herself, she decided to start this series of conversations. And she ran these conversations from 1839 to 1844. And women paid. They signed up for a series of conversations, and they paid a fee for this. And this, actually, as a result of this, she became one of the best paid public lecturers, as they called it in those days. And the way she ran the conversation was that she would give a talk about something, and then everybody would talk about it. And that's kind of what we're doing. Our conversations are patterned over that. So we're doing little talks and then going into inviting you into the conversation. And she ran about, I think, I was trying to find the number, but I think it was 5 or 6 series of these conversations. And then a few at the end had men in them, because the men really wanted to know what was going on. They couldn't stand this idea that, you know, the women were having too much fun. But her idea for this was to really help women articulate their ideas and to think, because this was not something that their education in most cases provided them with an opportunity for. She also encouraged them to ask the big questions like, what were we born to do? How shall we do it? And a number of these women went on to be leaders in the women's suffrage movement, the abolitionist movement, and other reform movements that followed. During this time, she also wrote an essay for The Dial, for this Transcendentalist magazine she was editing. This was after she was no longer the editor. She wrote an article called The Great Lawsuit, Man versus Men, Woman versus Women. And this was a really radical article that sort of laid out the rationale, philosophical rationale for gender equality. And Horace Greeley, who ran the New York Tribune in New York City, was so impressed with this he asked her to turn it into a book. And so she went to a country place in 1844. She went to a country place near the Hudson River to develop this essay into a book that he wanted to call Woman in the 19th Century. That wasn't what she wanted to call it. And while she was there, she learned that there was a prison that housed women criminals nearby called Sing Sing. Maybe you've heard of it. Ever on the lookout to learn more, she accepted an invitation to visit the women prisoners. And meeting these women, most of whom had been either prostitutes or thieves, blew her theory about proper female behavior wide open. And this was very characteristic of Margaret. She kept changing and growing throughout her life, and this was one of those experiences. To her surprise, she discovered there was a great deal of similarity in her conversations with the prisoners and her upper middle class cohorts in Boston. John Madison writes, Fuller saw womankind as indivisible, not only in a social sense, but also in a spiritual one. She appealed to women of means to recognize their connection with women and with all women, and to establish more just relationships along class lines. So she gets this book done, she goes to New York, she starts writing this is what Lori's going to talk about. Mm-hmm. She starts writing the column for the New York Tribune, and the book gets published, sells out immediately, goes into multiple printings, and starts causing a big furor. And it became the Bible of the women's suffrage movement. So just about everybody who followed, who was active in the suffrage movement, read that book. And it was published 3 years before the famous Seneca Falls First Women's Rights Convention, and you better believe most of the people who came there had read that book.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So in that book, she articulates a new vision for the relationship between men and women. A new manifestation is at hand, she declares. But I just want to point out one thing, because I don't mean to be taking up so much time, but it was really hard to write this and have it say anything meaningful without getting into some detail.
Of course.
But one of the things I found most interesting is that her concept of male and female was fluid. Mm. And I think we're just now beginning to really understand that today with all the issues about gender and gender identification. And here's how she put it. Male and female represent two sides of the great radical dualism, but in fact, they are perpetually passing into one another. Fluid hardens to solid, solid rushes to fluid. There is no wholly masculine man, no purely feminine woman.